And I think we're live. So, hello, I'm Thomas Marr, and it's kind of the first live stream of 2021, blowing off the cobwebs, so to speak. But joining me on the live stream this evening for me, it's like Michael Lamonato, an Australian freelance journalist. And hang on, I just get this right now. The presenter of the Strategy Report podcast and the Box of Neutrals as well. Welcome along, Michael.
Thanks for having me. 100% off the top of your head.
Absolutely, yeah. I have to say, just from what I can see on the screen here at the moment, it's bright where you are because you are in Melbourne and not in this part of the world at all. So it's like ridiculous o'clock in the morning for you.
Oh, it's not too bad, it's 9:30 and the sun's out and it's going to be a lovely day, and this weekend it's going to get up to like 40 degrees in Melbourne, so summer has arrived, and I guess a very different situation to what you're facing over there at the moment.
40 degrees? I thought that was Fahrenheit. Yeah, no, you are approximately about 10 times the temperature that we have at the moment. A warm day here in Ireland at the moment is 4 degrees. So, I'm upstairs in my house at the moment. I have the fire lit downstairs. And if I didn't have the fire lit, you would be able to see my breath. So, it's pretty cold.
Would have made a dynamic video, though, I suppose. Wouldn't have been a terrible thing.
It absolutely would, yeah. But it's 10:30 at night here. And so, what's that? We're 13 hours apart? I think it's 13 hours, isn't it?
Something like that. Yeah, I guess so. If it's 10, maybe 11. Maybe 11 hours.
11 hours. But yeah, you are in Melbourne in Australia. And of course, last week there was the news that Melbourne is not going to be hosting the season opener again this year. Disappointing for you? Disappointing for Melbourne?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is and it isn't, because on the one hand, at least now we have a date as opposed to it just being cancelled. That would have been much more disappointing. But it's been kind of weird. I mean, look, for everyone, the last 18 months or a year at least has been pretty weird, hasn't it? But, there have been no cases in Melbourne for a little while now. In most of Australia, the cases have been pretty low, and there's been optimism. You've probably seen that, the Australian Open's happening down the road pretty much from Albert Park, and it's not happening yet, and it's sort of spluttering along a little bit, but it's kind of
It hasn't got off
on.
to a particularly happy start, has it?
No, not so far. In fact, I saw just today there was another positive case among one of the players who was on one of those flights who was negative when they arrived. So that's kind of interesting. But it does kind of show that, there was always going to be a bit of trouble getting Formula One to work in the way they wanted it to work. And in some sense, I think F1 would have had an easier time because it's a bit more organized than like 500, 1,000 players or whatever it is that have rocked up. But I think the short of it is that they didn't want to do it a second time. There was a risk they wouldn't have been able to do it, this UK variant and all this kind of stuff. So it's good they've moved it. I'm a bit optimistic. Like, it depends who you ask, isn't it? I don't know what you think, but I'm optimistic it can happen in November. I mean, you don't want to make any bets about that far into the future in a time like this, do you? But, by then Australia reckons everyone here will be vaccinated, or most people will be vaccinated here. Hopefully it's a little bit more under control in Europe as well. I guess it'll be coming out of summer. So that time last year was a bit better off at least. So yeah. I'm optimistic in November we might actually get it. But like I said, it kind of depends. I mean, what's your view from it from over there? I guess we're coming from kind of different perspectives on it.
Well, at the moment, it's very much doom and gloom here in Ireland, and it doesn't look like the end is in sight at all. It's probably going to be May, probably June, before kind of things start to improve. But we're not holding a Grand Prix, so I'm not too worried about that, really. But in terms of the F1 calendar, obviously things are kicking off in Bahrain. We're going to have a lot of the European tracks again, probably that we had last year. That 23 race calendar that's been released, I don't see every single race on that calendar going ahead. I would imagine that we'll probably end up around the 20 mark by the time the season actually unfolds. Singapore, I'm not too sure about the likes of Singapore, Monaco, the city venues in general, I think are probably less likely. I know a few days ago Monaco came out and said, yeah, no, we're definitely holding the race in May. Yeah, absolutely. But we all know that's kind of what they have to say, really. They can't be seen to be breaking contract. Yeah. None of the promoters want to break contract with Liberty Media. So I think it's to be expected that they'll all come forward and say, yep, no, we're okay, we're holding the race. But in terms of actually holding a city race at the moment. I can't see one happening until midsummer or later, simply because.
I think so.
Sorry to interrupt you there,
No, sorry. I feel like I interrupted you. Please.
But if we were going to Monaco in May, I just think how would you keep people apart well enough, even in terms of the construction, the amount of people that are involved in putting up the signage and all the barriers and everything. I just don't see how it's feasible to do safely in such a very, very compact urban environment and then actually hold the race weekend as well. So I'm not convinced that Monaco in particular will go ahead in the opening kind of first 3 months of the championship. Do you see the likes of maybe China and everything like that going ahead this year?
Well, weirdly, I mean, again, it does depend on the virus and all that kind of stuff, what twists and turns might be in store. It's too early for me to have a beer, but I wish I could.
This is Baraka.
With China, I mean, it would be relatively easy to pull off China in the sense of permanent circuit doesn't have any of those street track concerns that you just talked about. And I feel like there's a certain confidence from China, from what I've heard, that there will be a space later in the year for them. And I guess logically you'd be looking at the US, Mexico, Brazil triple header as it is now. I would have thought it's unlikely all of them, maybe even all three of them would go ahead. At least one of them, I would suspect, will drop off, just judging by the sheer caseload there. I know that the US has started vaccinations, all that kind of stuff, but there's a lot going on over in that part of the world. So I could see China happening, but it's really going to be on their terms, I think. I think they feel like that they sort of, I mean, everything's been pretty under control there, hasn't it? And the fact that they've postponed without a date makes me think that they're confident there will be space opening up, which I guess speaks to what you were saying, which is that this isn't the calendar as we see it now that we're going to get. I don't think it'll be a million miles away from the one that they've released as it was sort of last year, where it was not really even recognizable most of the season. But I think there'll be a lot more focus on Europe, and then that final part of the year, of course, we can bank in a couple of rounds in the Middle East, for example, and then see what we can kind of pick off there. Hopefully Australia, of course, and then just whatever's available, maybe more rounds in Europe.
You can just amble down the road to that race, can't you?
Yeah, because this is the other thing, right? And this is particularly with street circuits, and then especially so with Australia, the most extreme example, I would guess, is that it's not just, finding the time to get there. You've got to add the setup time for Australia, but then also the shipping time, right? And that, I mean, Singapore wouldn't be too far away from Australia in terms of just the sheer logistics of that. And if you want to talk about somewhere like Monaco, it's really, the deadline is not now, because when did they cancel last year? Would have been after Australia came, maybe March, maybe April. They said they weren't going to do it.
I think it was late March Monaco was cancelled last year.
So it's all about, when all these tracks know that they've got their own deadlines before they will lose money from setting up a race. It's never going to happen.
Singapore, I think, was 3 months before.
Yes.
Singapore was 3 months before, I think, when they cancelled last year. So
because they need the shipping time, right? Like Australia's ships for Australia normally leave first or second week latest of January, depending on when exactly the race is, which is why all that was done at the very start of the year, because any later and there would have been a ship going nowhere.
Yeah. It's going to be very interesting to see how the final calendar actually works out this year. I'm going to make a prediction, and that is we don't get more than 20 races this year. There's 23 on the calendar as it stands, but I think we won't get more than 20. I think we'll lose. I'm going to say we'll lose Singapore, lose Azerbaijan, and maybe Monaco as well. Just primarily because they're central urban areas, and holding a race in urban areas like that, I think, might not happen. But I know you don't want to hear it, because Singapore and Australia are now quite close on the calendar, and they're both in urban areas. But
yes, yeah. Well, yeah. Look, I know I've got to be optimistic though, because it's just down the road from me, the track, and I want Formula One to go. It'll be a long time between races. Of course, we haven't had one since 2019, and already it'll be nearly 2 years.
It'll be 2.5 years between races in Melbourne.
And plus, then after, if we do host in November, presumably there'll be one the following March. So it'll be quite close. So in a sense, logistically, some people would probably think it'd be better off just to not have it in November and wait for March again. But I think there'd be something interesting about having it in November. This was a plan. I was hearing about the idea that November might be on the cards even from last year when the calendar hadn't come out yet because no one knew it was going to have the virus. This was even before the idea of vaccines was on the horizon. And, Australia in Adelaide used to be November, of course, and there are advantages to November. The weather is a little bit more unpredictable, weirdly, which is normally what it takes to get a good race at Albert Park, I'm not afraid to say. And also it means we might potentially get a championship, not necessarily a decider. I mean, this year maybe if it's the third last round, but you get a race that's a little bit more influential in the championship, which means even if the race is a little bit straightforward, you don't mind because it'll have an effect on, well, let's be realistic, it'll have an effect on how early Lewis will win the title, assuming he signs. And that at least, generates a little bit of interest.
Let's come back to that. Let's come back to that in a minute.
Is someone keeping an eye on case he announces while we're doing this?
He literally could announce it. Look, we'll come back to that in a sec. But yeah, I'm interested to see what Albert Park looks like in a kind of more autumnal setting compared to. Although then again, March is that autumn in?
That's autumn. Yeah. It'd be spring in November. It's pretty much like for like. Like the weather's almost exactly the same. It's fractionally colder. It's more likely to be wet. That's the major difference in November. And I think I'm right in saying the sun sets earlier because it'll be after daylight saving, so which means the race would have to be even at a worse time for Europe, presumably. Unless, depending on the daylight saving hours. But it's roughly the same. It's almost a like-for-like month swap.
Well, I just hope either way that it goes ahead. And for your sake, I hope that you're able to attend the race as a journalist, because as it stands, journalists aren't really getting any access to the paddock in Formula One. There's a couple of permanent journalists who are able to get access at a handful of races. Broadcast media tends to be kind of given the priority, but for the likes of you and me, it's very difficult to get into the paddock at the moment. And like my last event was pre-season testing last year, and I can't even tell the last race that I actually saw you at. 2019? Italy?
Must have been. I mean, my last race would have been, if you don't count last year's Australian Grand Prix, which I see photos of every so often, that big huddle when they announced the closure, thinking that seemed like the least wise format to announce a disease was circulating in the paddock. But anyway, it must have been 2019. Japan was my last race, I think. So it must have been Europe that season, maybe, that I would have seen you last. But it's been a while.
At the height of the Haas debacle.
Oh, of course. I saw some of your reporting on the various company shenanigans in the last month or so. Well, last month, really, with Williams' story saying he's coming back to Formula One, apparently. In what format? It's very difficult to decipher.
It's a very tricky situation. I've had a few chats with Williams' story recently, and he's adamant. He is absolutely adamant that Rich Energy are coming back to Formula One with an announcement in early February, and he's the company that we know as Rich Energy are formally registered as Lightning Volt with UK Companies House, but that company is currently in liquidation. All the legal troubles that they got into in 2019, an attempted coup, what Story describes as an attempted internal coup, has led to pretty much the destruction of that company. And the William Story says that is the UK distribution arm of what is an international company. The only problem is there isn't any real evidence to show that there is a bigger umbrella over the UK company. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see, because there is money there somewhere, because they're sponsoring OMG Racing in British Superbike, and presumably after this length of time, money is changing hands. So I think it's just a situation we're going to have to wait and see. I'm skeptical. I'm going to hold my hands up and say I'm skeptical. But Story is adamant and insistent that this is a turning point for Rich Energy. They're going to be back in Formula One, and that all the bad press and all the negativity towards his company and all. He says it's going to be personal vindication when he's able to announce the Formula One deal. Not quite sure who he might be signing up with. Presumably it's not Haas.
Well, yeah, you'd think not. Because it is interesting when I saw the Superbikes deal. Not that I don't know too much about exactly what the deal is, but it's essentially naming rights kind of sponsorship level, Haas level branding, as far as I could say. You would have to think that, everyone's seen what happened to Haas. Everyone knows the Williams story now in motor racing generally, I would say. Like, no one, surely in Superbikes haven't gone, oh, this guy seems nice, and have just taken a punt. Like, they would have figured that out, and surely there would have been, as you say, securities that mean that money has changed hands at this point.
Yeah.
But it's look, I know the Williams story saga is one of the really interesting ones in Formula One, but even when he signed with Haas, for the first relatively short part of that partnership, I suppose, you'd have to say the same thing. Right? Like, money had to be changing hands. Even when they went into this deal, there was a lot of speculation about this company seems a bit strange, a bit mysterious.
Even before it all kicked off, people were going, who the hell are these guys?
Yeah, like I remember because it was announced at the end of the year. I remember, I think around Mexican Grand Prix time the year before, someone had done the research into their company's listing, and they had something like £5 in the bank or something like that, some ridiculously small amount of money for a company that was about to sponsor a Formula One team.
Yeah.
And so, there's money somewhere in there, I guess, and somehow, sometimes the company does function, but it's clearly very opaque to us. And like you say, it's really just going to be a really tense and interesting wait and see to see what does happen.
Yeah, Story is actually he's a multi business owner, entrepreneur at the moment. He owns a beef jerky business, he owns an energy drinks business, and he holds I think it's one of these data cloud companies as well.
Right.
That's recently been set up in the last year or so. But of the companies that he's listed as a director of, that one company is in liquidation. So I just thought the timing of it, was hilarious, because it was basically, I got an email notification from Companies House just going, Lightning Bolt in liquidation. Log on to Twitter. Rich Energy are going, yes, we're sponsoring a Formula One team. And it's like, I'm not quite sure how that's...
Surely, yeah. Is it just like a distraction? Surely not. I mean, it's too big a distraction, too brazen a distraction to just try and prevent people from reading about the company going into liquidation.
I don't think
it's very strange.
I don't think anyone would have paid him much attention, to be honest, if he didn't come forward with this. We're back in Formula One. I don't think anyone would have really cared.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I don't think I've ever spoken to Williams Story, so I wouldn't speculate. But even the arrival of Rich Energy, let's say the company more broadly in Formula One, seemed to be very much on that model. It was like, okay, didn't seem to be any cans when the company started, very few at least. But there's nothing wrong, I suppose you could say, of what's the phrase? Like, fake it till you make it, right? Like, you get the sponsorship, you get the notoriety, and then suddenly you've got the interest, you accumulate some capital, and you start making cans, and it was like you had them all along. In fact, I think, isn't it who used to sponsor the team we now know as Aston Martin? Which energy brand was that? They
Hype.
did a similar kind of thing, essentially. Hype. They sort of, I don't want to liken them to what's happened to Rich Energy, of course, but they were sort of a very small company, but then they're sponsoring a Formula One team.
That's Bertrand Gachot who owns that company.
Yeah, right. And so, look, there's nothing wrong with that because it can work out. And look, that's a business strategy. But you'd have to say, I don't think he's made it. He's done a lot of faking it so far. And good on him. He's having a go. But I'll be very interested to see, because also I really enjoyed that story, not on a Schadenfreude level or anything like that, but just I feel like that's very 90s Formula One, isn't it? Like good old Formula One days. I don't often talk about the good old days, but this was one of those stories. It's
the most interesting sponsor I think we've had in probably since the T-minus saga in 99, I think it was. Yeah, 99, with Arrows. Apart from that, you don't really see teams and sponsors being at each other's throats while the sponsor is still on the car. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah, 2019 was just brilliant for that. It was just this whole while the on track stuff wasn't particularly interesting in 2019, we had this sponsorship debacle and Haas and Gunther Steiner then obviously having to be, I'm not talking to you guys about this, and it was just a summer of that. And I made sure to rob one of the Rich Energy cans with the with the antlers that he wasn't allowed to use on the cans. I made sure to sneak off with one of them after the court case. So I think it was at Monaco. While we were down with Kevin Magnussen or one of the drivers, I went over to the fridge and just made sure to get one of the cans, and it's now sitting in my display cabinet downstairs.
It's probably worth a lot of money. I regret that I never thought to take one. It's probably going to be very valuable one day.
Well, the problem was that obviously, with airline travel rules, you can't have any liquid.
Oh, yeah, of course. So do you have to risk it in your luggage?
No, I had to empty the can and then try to preserve.
Oh, really?
I had to try and preserve it in my luggage without crushing it. And of course, when I got back, it was crushed a bit. So it's kind of a bit dented and stuff. And
that's okay.
It really kind of...
I've heard it just tastes like Red Bull anyway, so I don't think you're missing out on anything.
I actually quite liked it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I thought it was like, for the few weekends that I had access to it, I was choosing it over the Red Bull energy drink.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I thought it was just a bit. I thought it was a bit smoother. I thought it was a bit nicer to drink. But Red Bull obviously do all the stuff like ginger and the lime flavor as well. Here we are, sponsored by Red Bull.
Well, maybe not. I mean, you've just said hashtag better than Red Bull, so maybe it was true. Maybe that was your kernel of truth.
Yeah, but no, I quite like the drink. And no, I'm very interested to see if William Story comes back, because also there's that level of accessibility as well. It's like most sponsors are kind of these, carefully managed corporate, very clean sponsors. And then you've got Rich Energy, which seems to be one guy who has no problem kind of saying what he wants to say. And if you follow him on Twitter, he makes his thoughts very clear on pretty much whatever he feels like talking about on the day. And I think it's very refreshing. And I'd love to see them back, simply because the headlines, because I don't like things being nicey in Formula One. I don't like when everyone's pals with each other, and I like the venom. I like the fighting. I like all of that stuff. So I think Rich Energy coming back in and winding everybody up would just be absolutely fantastic entertainment. Not quite sure what team is going to take a gamble on signing up with them.
That's the question, isn't it? Yeah, like who would it be? Maybe he's had us all. And you remember where there was, I don't know if it still exists, but remember there was that chain called Formula One Hotels? Maybe that's what he means.
I don't know. I can't tell.
Going to put a vending machine in every Formula One hotel.
Or we're coming back to Formula One. He didn't say specifically that he's joining a team. Maybe he's just supplying drinks to the Paddock Club.
Maybe he's just bought a ticket to one of the races.
You don't know. It's I don't know. Apparently it's early February, so hopefully in about two weeks we'll know exactly what's going to be going on with Rich Energy. But look, we could talk about William Story and Rich Energy and that whole mess forever, but there is actually something specific I wanted to talk about on the stream this evening, and that is Sergio Perez. We got all the pictures yesterday. We got the video of him walking through the doors. I thought it was very strange. Red Bull supplied this footage of Sergio Perez at the factory, and it was just him walking outside the factory with his hands in it. It looked really strange. It was just him walking around aimlessly outside the factory, and then they got him to walk through the 3 different sets of doors. So we never actually saw him doing anything in the factory. It's all the footage is just of him walking into the factory. So I don't know what that was all about. But how do you think he's going to do it, Red Bull?
I think it's going to be really interesting. I will say off the bat, and I don't think this is a sort of a surprise to anyone, but I don't think he's going to beat Max. That's the least bold prediction one could probably make about that team rivalry. But I'm so interested to see how he does. I think he'll do Well, I think he'll do well. We all know he's a good driver. That's the thing. But then again, we all knew Pierre Gasly was a good driver. I think Alex Albon is also a good driver. I think he's probably better than they both were at Red Bull. I mean, Alex was only just at Red Bull. Pierre's, I think, developed a lot since he left Red Bull.
Yeah.
But it's going to be really interesting either because he gets kind of close to Max and we're like, oh yeah, he's pretty much as good as we all thought, kind of underrated for a lot of his career. He can deliver, be that driver that picks up the pieces when Max isn't able to finish a race or whatever the situation is. Or he's going to have all the same struggles that these other drivers did, or similar struggles. And then we're going to have to ask, why is that? Is it because Max is just an unbelievably talented, well, I mean, he is an unbelievably talented driver, but is he just on some other plane of driving ability that we'd never considered? Or is there genuinely something about either the way the team has built that car around Max, and I'm probably going to say around Max a lot, or is it something about that way the team functions with a second driver that doesn't work? Because now and this is kind of the reason they've got Perez, right, is because they are maybe a little bit unsure as to exactly why these two juniors that they've rated relatively well haven't performed. So they're going for a bit of a control driver.
Yeah.
But finding the answer to that is going to be so interesting this season. I hope he does really well, whatever the result is.
Yeah.
Because I think he is one of those drivers who deserved, well, I mean, he kind of got his shot at McLaren, didn't he? But it was too early. But deserved a bit more of a shot. And I'm hoping that this is that shot for him.
Yeah, what you were saying there about the two juniors, like that second seat hasn't really worked for anybody since Ricardo, if you want to say that, was in the second seat. I don't think that, whatever it is about Max, I don't think his driving style is so particularly unique or out there that it should be impossible for whoever's alongside him to be able to adjust to the car. I can't see what could be so fundamentally different about the car that one driver is able to drive it and the other just simply is not. I can't see in modern F1 how that could be the case. I don't think there's any sabotage going on, but I don't think there's any maybe help from Red Bull to address the situation quite as much for Pierre or for Alex. They gave Alex a long time. They gave him a year and a season and a half, basically. And instead of getting better, he got worse over that season and a half.
Yeah.
So I think that it's going to be more down to the type of people they are. And the thing about Sergio is that he's a mature man. He's 10 years older than Alex and Pierre. He's been around in the sport for a decade now. He's raced for McLaren. He was part of the Ferrari Driver Academy 10 years ago. He's raced for Force India now for 7 years. He's a mature guy, but the thing is, he has absolutely nothing to lose this year. He was out of a drive. He was potentially out of Formula One, and now he has this opportunity in front of him. I think that if he is not quite able to perform and he feels that it's down to the car, I don't think he'll be a shrinking violet in the way that Pierre and Alex were, and, not calling the team out on it. I think Sergio will make it very clear if there's an issue with Red Bull. I don't think he will let them away with it. I think if he has any suspicions or he feels that he's not getting the support that he should be getting from Red Bull, I'm pretty sure Sergio will go straight up to the likes of Sky TV or whatever and say it publicly. I don't think there's any question that he won't call Red Bull out on their crap if they're pulling any.
Yeah, well, I think this is part of the really interesting component of this, because you can trace it all the way back almost to Mark Webber and even to an extent Daniel Ricciardo. I know there are a lot of reasons that Daniel left Red Bull. They weren't that, as it was sort of made out that, Max is the number one. That wasn't really exactly it. But I think Mark said in his book, or he said in an interview, I can't remember which, that there wasn't any necessarily favoritism. I know there was like the front wing saga and all that kind of stuff, but there wasn't really a lot of like number one, number two kind of favoritism. But there was this real emotional backing of Sebastian Vettel, and you could kind of understand that with Vettel and Webber, because Vettel was the guy he was their junior, he was their hope. Webber was sort of there to set up the team. I can kind of understand that, unfair though it probably was.
Yeah.
And then we got a similar kind of sort of similar response with Daniel and Max, wasn't it? You remember when they signed Verstappen on, I think it was a 3-year deal, it was a year before Daniel left, and the press release said, well, now Max can build the team around him, and Daniel even admitted, like, he didn't feel slighted by that at all, but he said, I can understand that if Red Bull had the opportunity to make Max the youngest world champion, they'd prefer that. Like, that's what they'd want.
Yeah.
They're here to market the brand, after all, and that's very on brand for them. And I thought it was really interesting because I think part of the reason Pierre subsequently struggled is because the team didn't seem to support him that well. And I know you don't want to judge anything by Drive to Survive because it is a narrative story. It's not the full picture.
Yeah, it's dramatized.
Even the clips of, exactly, dramatized. But even the clips of his engineer at certain parts of the season sounded very aggressive. And the impression I've always had was that Pierre wasn't feeling, I'm not necessarily saying the team didn't support him, but didn't seem to be supporting him in the way that he required. And then we saw this really interesting change with Alex, didn't we? Where they seemed to be going out of their way to make sure that he felt supported. And yet somehow he continued to get worse through the season. That, for me, is what's really interesting, is that it's not necessarily that they're favouring Max Verstappen. They're not giving him the better car or anything like that. I think he's clearly one of the great drivers, of course. But is there something even, in the culture of the team? I don't want to say that in a necessarily negative or critical way, but it seems like there's something about being able to focus on two cars at that team that they are perhaps working on. Maybe that's what they've been doing this year. But that seems like it's sort of been a miss for several years now. And like you said, with Perez, he's not going to keep quiet about that kind of stuff, not only because he's a more mature driver, he knows what's going on, but because he knows this is his shot. And if it doesn't work out this year, and maybe even if it does, he might still not have a seat the following year. So that's, for me, is going to be a kind of telling part of this situation, that is there something wrong with Red Bull trying to manage two cars?
There is that possibility that they are very single-minded in terms of how they approach the racing, and it's just, let's see how Max is doing. Oh, and there's the other guy. You know those jokes that used to be made about Ferrari a few years ago, where it was where Raikkonen was the number 2. Oh, we forgot Kimi's in the race. Yeah, that kind of thing. But I think it's more a case of the mentality of the drivers. Pierre and Alex are young guys. They're getting their first opportunity, nearly in Formula. Like, Alex was only in Formula One a few months when he stepped into that Red Bull. Signed, of course, for Nissan in Formula E, and then bought out of that contract by Helmut Marko to bring him into Red Bull, AlphaTauri, and from there then promoted straight into a Red Bull. So within 6 months, that's a huge change in mindset and the way you have to go racing. And I think that when you compare how Alex and Pierre come across compared to Max is this guy who you never get any impression from him that there's even a shred of self-doubt in him. He's the kind of guy who just oozes confidence. If something goes wrong, it's someone else's fault. And I think that's a critical component, I think, that was missing for Pierre and Alex. They're lovely guys. They're clearly very good racers, but they're the type of guys who I think need to be nurtured, and they maybe aren't quite as mentally strong as Max. And I think Sergio is going to bring some more of that aggression and some more of that self-belief that I think that second seat at Red Bull needs. I don't think Sergio has any doubts in his own abilities. So I think at this point in his career, he knows how good he is and how good he can be. So if things start to go wrong for him, I don't think he'll start to question himself. I think he'll start to question the team. And this is where I say that I think he will start calling them out publicly, if that's to happen. And I hope he does, because we want to see two Red Bulls fighting in the same way that we see, like, say, two Mercedes constantly up at the front, maybe not fighting, but pretending to fight. But Nick Ritz has written in to ask, if Perez doesn't deliver, what do they do?
Well, I was going to ask, just on the back of what you were saying, and dovetails wonderfully with that question, which is that, let's say he doesn't perform well, or even if he does, let's talk about even long-term, next couple of years. If confidence is so key to being in that team and against Max Verstappen, what odds does the junior program have of ever succeeding if the idea is to just promote guys who've only been in Formula One a year or two? You know, they've done well enough at AlphaTauri as it is now. what hope does anyone have? Or if it only takes someone like Perez who's been around for 10 years, then surely, and maybe this is why they're saying it's not such a junior team anymore, but a team in its own right. But it does kind of suggest that pathway up to Red Bull is no longer functional because no one can take that. And so I do wonder, like, what is it going to mean for Perez then, and in terms of his place in that driver pipeline?
It's an odd one because I know in Mark Webber, in his book, he said he always felt a bit like an outsider at Red Bull, despite how long he was there. And that was simply because he hadn't been brought up through the Red Bull ranks. Mm-hmm. But the thing about it is, like, when you look back over the history of the Red Bull program and everything, Sebastian Vettel is the only true success of that program. And that's because he came up at a time when Red Bull weren't front runners. So when he was promoted into the Red Bull, there wasn't that same level of expectation on his shoulders. He was able to grow with the team. And next thing, in 2010, when things started coming good for Red Bull, Vettel was there to capitalise on it. And he and Red Bull turned into a front-running championship-winning team at the same time. And that hasn't happened since then. So Max has been very successful in terms of he's clearly a front-running in terms of ability driver. We have yet to see him successfully challenge for a championship. You can argue that that's the car, not him. But there isn't that undisputable proof that the level of success is going to be there for Red Bull in the first place. So when you look at Max, there's no guarantee that he was there to actually win the championship in the last couple of years, or would have been able to win the championship in the last couple of years, regardless. So I think for the likes of Perez this year, when he has the 1 year with them, because he is only on a 1 year contract, he's going to be under huge internal pressure, I think, simply because Red Bull are constantly looking for the next name that they can promote into their main team and towards the front of Formula One. And I think that man is going to be Yuki Tsunoda. You have to look at, he seems to have all the backing of Helmut Marko. There seems to be an internal desire to have Tsunoda do well. Also coming with Honda backing, and if rumours are true, Honda are going to be remaining somewhat involved with Red Bull into the next couple of years, even if it's Red Bull maintaining the Honda engine program. But this is where I think Perez is going to face a lot of pressure this year, and it's simply coming from Tsunoda. If Tsunoda performs well, do Red Bull immediately go, let's get Perez out of that seat and put Tsunoda into it? Or if Perez is doing well, do they go, we'll keep Perez and we'll keep Tsunoda at AlphaTauri despite the fact that he's our product while Perez isn't? It's going to be a tough one.
It's going to be a tough one, but if they did, I mean, it depends on how well Tsunoda does. If he does, unquestionably, if he's absolutely dominating Pierre, then you'd probably say it's a pretty strong argument. But if he's just doing well, then why would you believe that he's going to do any better than any other juniors who were doing? Don't forget, of course, Alex Albon was doing well. That's why they put him in there. Gasly was doing well before that. I was sort of struck, just as you were talking, I was thinking that I think it was Zach Brown who said the other day, or you never know, it could have been a couple of weeks ago. All time seems to have compressed over the last couple of months, but that the McLaren approach to their junior driver program is going to remain really focused. Like they pick like one driver at a time. Same with Mercedes. Or was it Mercedes did it? No, I'm pretty sure it was McLaren. They pretty much pick one or two drivers and then they really develop them and they pick them carefully and that's the kind of thing. Whereas Red Bull's the opposite approach, not necessarily saying it's better or worse, but they induct 4 or 5 in total they have in a year. They're racing all around the place, a couple of different series, and then they kind of whittle them down as they get towards the top. But to go back to what you said, there's not really any evidence that this program works in the way that they kind of make it out to work. Because, okay, Vettel, championship winner, wasn't originally their product, came from the BMW program. Verstappen, Mercedes, was bought the year before he arrived in Toro Rosso as it was. They didn't develop him. He was clearly a great talent. They saw that, they bought him, and that's why they got him. So I can understand that. Look, the drivers before Vettel, of course, weren't their products at all. Daniel Ricciardo, Carlos Sainz, I guess you would say they were their products. You can say that the fact they're very good shows that there's something in that program, but obviously neither is a championship winner. Only one is a race winner. Of course, that's circumstance in Formula One, but still it counts for something. There's not really any evidence. So to go back to your question about, well, what's going to happen to Tsunoda, that just because he looks like he's doing really well at AlphaTauri, that he is their next guy, because lots of their juniors have always looked good, and they've thrown in a couple in Red Bull lately, and even some that looked good in Toro Rosso but ultimately didn't come to anything, inevitably get binned. So I sort of wonder whether that program, because it's been the most hyped junior program in Formula One, right? Like, no one talks about the others because they're not as big, I suppose. But, people know George Russell's Mercedes Junior, but not the Mercedes program. There's so much hype around it, but there's not that much evidence to suggest it should be considered like the program in terms of making Formula One drivers.
Yeah, it's how many drivers do they have signed at the moment? I think it's 6, 7.
Yeah, it's normally around that number, and it fluctuates a lot, doesn't it? Sometimes you'll log on, you go, oh, 2 drivers have been dropped for some reason.
Yeah, it's a tough one. These driver academies are tough, and I don't think there's enough movement to make them all work simultaneously. Mercedes obviously keep theirs very streamlined. They've got Russell waiting in the wings. Frederick Vesti was signed there a few days ago. I don't think there's anyone else that's formally part of the Mercedes Academy or driver program. Not off the top of my head. Ferrari have a few at the moment, and one is stepping up to Formula One this year with Haas. Callum Ilott is still going to be knocking around, still with Ferrari. There's a couple going to be in Formula 2 that needed that extra year of development. And that's all well and good. Don't know where they're going to end up next year, because the seats simply aren't there unless Raikkonen and Giovinazzi are both gone this time 12 months. But at the moment as well, Renault, they're dropping 1 or 2 of their current driver academy, and they're going to be signing up another 1 or 2. So they're going to have, I think, 5 on their program as well. But to get back just to Red Bull, obviously the drivers they're signing are very good drivers. Like we can see with their successes in other championships, how well they're doing. But I think they're so desperate to find someone who's absolutely top tier that they're not giving everybody the correct amount of time to develop before putting them into a front-running car. And you could say that, oh, well, if Max can do it and the likes of Charles Leclerc can adjust that quickly, then, anybody that's good enough should be able to do it. But we still see Charles Leclerc making stupid mistakes sometimes and, hitting his teammate occasionally and, just sometimes making stupid dive bombs. So, Leclerc isn't absolutely the finished product yet either. I think the tough 2020, I think, will have done a lot to help him develop towards that finished product. But I think Red Bull are so desperate to find the next. You have to say Vettel, because Vettel is the one who won the championships. But they're so desperate to find someone who can replicate that success that they're not giving the young lads the same amount of time. Vettel was given 3-4 years. And
he crashed a lot.
Including taking Webber out at Fuji in 2007. That, nowadays, I don't think the driver would survive going through that. Can you imagine,
it's a good call.
In those days, can you imagine a comparable thing nowadays would be, I don't know, Gasly taking out Verstappen under the safety car in the closing stages of a race. And this was at a time when Red Bull hadn't won yet. So that was a huge error and a huge thing for Vettel to get away with. But he did get away with it. And he was given that time, and then 3 years later he was winning championships. That isn't happening with Gasly and Albon. But the thing with Albon was that there was no signs of any sort of promise throughout most of 2020. There was never really an occasion where it was, okay, he clearly has got the better of Verstappen here, or, that's a drive that is eye-opening. There was nothing. There was no notable moment for Albon.
I suppose, look, well, you're right. Like, you couldn't really say he had any standout races. He had some very good racing. There were a couple of races where because he qualified poorly or had a bad start, had to overtake a lot of cars. Of course, usually had a car advantage, but the Red Bull didn't always have a massive car advantage, particularly at the start of the season when they were a little bit closer to the midfield. But I guess that again goes to exactly what you were saying, was that I know they were saying they only needed him to be within about 0.3 of Verstappen. But if the bar was to occasionally have Verstappen's measure, I think that's just unrealistic, because I think sometimes the other thing we forget about Max is that, of course he's very good, but he's also very experienced now. I know he's only, 22 or 23 years old, whatever it is, but...
It's annoying, isn't it, how young he is?
Yeah, he's still quite young, but he's been around for ages, and he's been at that team for 8, and he's only been in a Red Bull program from Toro Rosso to Red Bull. Like, he's very comfortable and very experienced. The idea that a guy could come in with 1 year of Formula One experience at 2 different teams within 6 months of each other and be close to a driver at that level suggests that you think he's at Max's level, which he isn't. I don't think any of their juniors are, and I don't think that's an indictment on them, because you can still be an excellent Formula One driver and not be quite as quick as Max. Or to think that they can get that close within such a small amount of time, I think goes to exactly like you were saying, the idea that they're looking for their next wonder kid, and maybe whether that's Vettel or Verstappen they've got in mind doesn't really matter. But I think that that's kind of wrong, and maybe that's too much. That their program's all about sink or swing, right? Like the idea that you get your shot, and if you do well, then you're going to be great, and if you don't, then you're no good and goodbye. But I just don't know that is always going to be the best case. And you'd have to say the number of drivers they've dropped would suggest it's not. Maybe there's got to be a different approach for them. They've got to slow that down. They've got to give drivers time, like you said, to make those mistakes, because, okay, Formula One isn't a finishing school. We know that. You've got to take that opportunity. But young drivers are always going to make some amount of mistakes. And Charles Leclerc was another really great example. And I know that it looks like his trajectory was really extreme, right? Like every year he was moving up, and then including the 1 year he had in Formula One, moved straight to Ferrari. But had he had a less impressive year at Sauber, I'm sure they would have given him more time, and he would have just gotten better eventually. And then even when he arrived at Ferrari, don't forget, it was stated that he would not be, I know it wasn't a formal number 2 driver, but that Vettel was their man and he was there to kind of learn the ropes.
Look at Giovinazzi.
And then it just so happened that he smacked him.
Giovinazzi's been given the time.
Exactly right. So the only driver I can think of really in recent times who's made that really massive jump and made an immediate impact is Max, who went straight from Formula 3 into Formula 1 and then was in Red Bull before too long. Before him, I guess, Kimi Raikkonen. But that just doesn't really happen. And, there are other drivers caught up. Like, I feel like Lance Stroll got caught up in that as well. I mean, I know he had his father really pushing him towards Formula 1. Like, they were looking for that outcome. But to me, he's another driver who was promoted during that real hype of Max Mania, being the youngest guy to arrive and winning Formula 3 and rocking up in Formula 1. And I think his whole career is going to suffer because of that, because he's always being held up as a young championship winner, but he's only made it in Formula 1 because of the money. I think he's really quick, but I think that's always going to be a shadow over him. And I feel like that really just goes to illustrate that we shouldn't be using Max as a model.
No, I'd agree with that. But let's put on our time-traveling goggles, and we'll step into our crappy TARDIS, and we'll go one year into the future. And so it's January 2022. Is Perez still in the Red Bull?
I think so. I think he will be, because I think they clearly don't want to promote Pierre for some reason, whatever the reason is. I don't think Tsunoda's going to be so great that they should feel obliged to promote him immediately. I hope he does well. I hope he is the future of the team. But again, 1 year in the sport for me is not enough. And he's relatively young, Tsunoda, as well. I think he deserves to have a bit more time before he goes to Red Bull. And I mean, as much as they're holding on to Albon with the potential of returning, he'll have not raced for a year. And as long as Perez does well, which I think he will, I think he should. I reckon he will stay for another year. And the consistency, you'd think, I know the rules are changing, but maybe that is a pro for Albon, who'll be working on the car. I'm going to say yes. What do you reckon?
I think I'd agree. I think Perez this time next year will still be in the Red Bull. I don't think he'll get a long contract. I think it'll be kind of 1 year deals.
The Bottas treatment.
Yeah, keep him on tenterhooks, keep him in check, because we're not giving you a long-term contract. So,
yeah.
No, I think Perez will still be in the car. I think he's going to have a successful 2021. I think he's going to run Max closer, a lot closer than many, but people think that he will. I think Perez is not far off the real deal nowadays. Maybe not quite championship winning, but I think he's very, very good in the upper third of the field in terms of ability. And speed, and I was looking back at videos of him from even his McLaren days, and there were moments of magic in there, even in a year that was viewed as a bad year for him. So I think Perez will have a more consistent year than Max will this year. I think Max will have higher highs, but I think he'll have lower lows as well. I think Sergio will be a consistent thorn in the side for third, fourth place throughout the year. And he'll keep racking them up. And we've seen before in the past that even the slightest opportunity of something better than where the car deserves to be, and he'll take it. So I think there will be second places on the table, and I think he'll sneak at least 1 or 2 wins as well over the course of the year. So I think he's going to have a very successful 2021. This time next year, he'll be part of the furniture, I think, at Red Bull by this time next year. And I couldn't be happier for him. I think it's a great opportunity after, the way Racing Point kind of turned their back on him despite having a contract. Like, I get the logic of why they're doing what they're doing, but at the same time, it was, they were throwing out their higher performing driver, and that's never really a particularly good thing. So, how do you think Perez is going to fare this year?
Yeah, I think he's the driver they need, right? Like, he's not going to be as close to Max in qualifying because I think he's just not quite the Saturday before. And we saw that even this year, that occasionally Stroll was getting close to him. He's good on Saturday, but it's not his strength. But the driver they really want is someone to strategize with, right? Like, let's say that Red Bull is a more consistent second best car because, if they work out the problem that they had in 2020, which they should have, then they'll be more consistently, I don't think challenging Mercedes for a championship, but challenging them from race to race, whether that's just for second place or occasionally the win. And what they've really needed for the last couple of years is a driver that is close enough to Max in the race they can play with the strategies and overcomes the Mercedes cars. And that's Perez's strength, right? Like, he can do whatever strategy you ask him. He's great with the tyres. I think he's really grown into that, having that view of the overall race as a result of that. I think he's 100% the driver they need for that. And as a result, I think they're going to really benefit from that from the championship. I think that's going to really give him an opportunity to show off his strengths, which I think is going to translate into him hopefully staying a little bit longer. And will hopefully give us a more interesting season. And even if that doesn't mean a different championship outcome, as long as from race to race we're getting interesting results in Grand Prix, then that's all we can really ask for in the last year of the rules, I suppose. So I think he is going to have a good season in that respect, because I think that is his opportunity now to show everything he's learned over the his career, really. This is his opportunity to really put that together in a car that will allow him to show them off.
Yeah, this year is the culmination of 10 years of experience and 10 years of knowledge. And I can't wait to see how he does. Honest Election Posters, which is a great username, says Perez has proven that he performs well under pressure. I'd agree with that. I think he's immense under pressure. I think he's actually... I think that's the maturity and the experience and that calm, methodical approach that he brings to Formula One. He's not an emotionally driven driver. And I think that will stand to him in a major way in 2021.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And underrated a little bit, I think, because think about this year that he's had. There were either rumours about him losing his seat, his contracted seat, or subsequently had no seat. Wasn't announced until after the end of the season. Picked up a win along the way.
Won a race while unsigned.
Yeah, exactly. And finished best of the midfield and ahead of Albon. It's his best season of his career, probably. I mean, certainly in terms of results, I'm struggling to think of a more complete season from him. I know he had first part of the year was a little bit slow, but then I think the team had a couple of problems then as well. And once it all clicked together, ironically after he recovered from COVID, had a great run. All the while, being under the most pressure you can be as a racing driver, which is not being contracted. So if we're talking about him being on a 1-year deal, whether or not the team's going to keep him in check, I don't think that'll be a problem for him. I think he will be able to perform, assuming everything else is kind of in place. The pressure's not going to be a problem for him.
Compare Perez's season to the one Vettel had. Now, obviously, we don't know the timeline of everything that went on talks-wise with Vettel and Racing Point / Aston Martin. But Vettel knew from pre-season that he wasn't going to be in Formula 1. Now, presumably, he didn't sign the deal with Racing Point instantly as the season started. No. Presumably, it was kind of late summer, maybe a bit later than that. We don't know exactly when that contract was signed. But at a time when he wanted to be in the shop window to extend his Formula 1 career, Vettel checked out completely. He had a terrible year. He was dreadful pretty much throughout the entirety of 2020. Compare that to Perez, who has known for most of the year that he was out of a drive, no guarantee of anything. Look at the two ways that they approached their season. Now, you could argue that Vettel couldn't be bothered, maybe as a punishment towards Ferrari. It's just, what are you going to do about it? Fire me? So maybe Vettel just didn't care. But that wouldn't help him secure a seat for the next year, that approach. It might be satisfying to go kind of feck you to Ferrari and then produce the season that he did. But it's not very good for him in terms of, he's going into Aston Martin with question marks over his head. People are going, was this a good idea? Aston Martin, Lawrence Stroll, what are you doing signing Vettel? There are those question marks. So, but compare Vettel and Perez's seasons, and Perez just got on with it, and he delivered weekend in, weekend out. I don't think, was there any weekend where Perez didn't perform compared to Stroll? I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Only maybe at the start, I can't off the top of my head, but only maybe at the start of the year he was occasionally quite close. Like I remember thinking after a couple of rounds that Stroll had actually upped his game this season. But I think in retrospect, we would say that Perez probably underperformed. Stroll did have a bit of a ropey run in the middle of the year as well, to be fair to him. But I think at the start of the year, I don't necessarily think he underperformed at any point, but didn't perform at the level he was towards the end of the year. When I guess you could say the chips were really down for him, like at the most critical point of his season, he was performing absolutely at his best. On Vettel, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because the last time he phoned it in, he got signed by Ferrari. So it's sort of, I guess it works for him as a strategy, doesn't it? Somehow underperforming gets him deals. So I don't know why, but it works.
I'm going to be crap this year. I fancy being signed by a new prestige car manufacturer.
Yeah. The garage is looking a little bit empty. I'm going to phone it in and see how we go. Oh, I've got an Aston Martin in the garage now. It is strange, isn't it? There is something in that, though. I think, jokes aside, I suppose, in 2014, Ricciardo beat him. I think that was fair enough. But there was also clearly a degree of him deciding, and at the time it seemed like he was in a bad mood about the regulation changes and Red Bull falling off the pace. This time around, you'd say he was upset
Michael
about
Schumacher.
the fact. Yeah, I suppose so. And then, that's a good point, actually. And then, more recently, he was dropped by Ferrari and kind of strung along by Ferrari as well, which I think was kind of unethical. The idea that he thought, I remember, it was just before, because they announced it early May, didn't they? So it must have been April. He did an interview, I think, with the Formula One website, and he was like, looking forward, we'll do a deal, probably by the time the season starts. And a couple of weeks later, it turned out not only did they never offer him a contract, but from as early as December the previous year had been talking to Carlos Sainz.
That's what I found astonishing. I was at pre-season testing, and there was that press conference called by Ferrari. And I remember everyone thinking it's Binotto and Vettel sitting down together for their own press conference. Surely it's a contract extension. Like, why else would they call this?
Yeah.
And so we all went in and it was a packed room, everyone sitting there kind of going, oh, I wonder what news we're going to get. And then almost immediately it was a case of, no, we're not confirming anything or anything. But Binotto was sitting there in the press conference talking to us all, talking to Sebastian. It was all happy, chappy. This was pre-COVID, so there was no masks. Everyone was smiling. And it was all just like, we're going to sit down with glasses of wine and we're going to talk about the contracts, and our intentions are to work it all out, and we're going to have a contract in place. And it was all very much like, yeah, this is only a formality. And then a few weeks later, it was a case of, actually, no, Seb's out of here, and we actually signed someone too. So all that time, it was blatant lies from Binotto. And I can see why Sebastian would take that so personally.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no other way you can take that. I mean, he's, for Vettel's faults and strengths, he's a very, they're all pretty proud drivers, I suppose, aren't they? It's kind of part of the thing. But he's a proud guy and believes that his championships earn him respect, and I think they do. I think it's fair to say, as a four-time world champion, you do deserve some respect, even if you've been sort of smacked around by Leclerc the previous year, but not by, they were equal on points at the end. That's no terrible thing.
Oh.
The fact that it was drawn on so long, and even remember their launch, their big, ritzy launch. What was the phrase? That Vettel is our number one preference for the seat.
Yeah,
because
they'd already signed Carlos.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like the fact that the intention in the background was always to not necessarily always to not keep him, but clearly their preference was for Sainz. So they'd been negotiating since December, or initiated contact in December and then subsequently began negotiating. So I can understand why he would feel slighted. Clearly still feels a lot for the team. We could see by the time it finished that he still was very emotional about the Ferrari idea, but I can kind of understand why he kind of wasn't on it this year. On top of that, the car was clearly a bit of a dog at times, and he's a bit more of a sensitive driver, isn't he? If the car doesn't work the way he likes, he's not going to get results. So all of those things combined into a pretty poor season. There are questions asked for him, I think. It's kind of weird with him, isn't it? Because there have been questions, even from when he was winning his championships, asked about how really good he is. And I don't know that we do that with multiple champions so often. So it is a kind of weird place for him to be in.
Yeah, but speaking of contracts and being strung along, it's a good segue, isn't it?
It's all right.
Lewis Hamilton doesn't have a contract. It's late January, and that Mercedes seat is still unoccupied formally.
Well,
what's going on?
He's out of contract now, isn't he? Contracts normally run till
December 31st,
December or 1st of January or whatever. So he's technically not a Mercedes driver anymore. He was entered by the team, wasn't he, on the entry sheet from memory? I think the only team that didn't enter a driver was Red Bull because they hadn't signed Perez yet.
Yeah.
So they're clearly confident the contract will be agreed. But at this point, Hamilton's posting videos of him going for runs or whatever. He's clearly got time to sit down and have a chat, if that were the only barrier, as they for so long suggested it was, that there was no time between winning the first championship and then the second championship and then Hamilton getting COVID and then end of year celebrations. Then it was Christmas and then it was New Year. It's like, I'm sure they found some time. I'm sure there's been a little bit of time between watching Netflix and eating your Christmas pudding for him to have done a deal. For what is, for most parts, you would think a relatively straightforward deal. They've done so many up to this point. It's not as if any of them were probationary contracts. They're all long-term, regular, ordinary contracts. It does make you wonder what the holdup is. And, the obvious answer is money, but I don't know. Can it really only just be, for this long, just be money? It's hard to say. It's all speculative, isn't it? No one really knows much more than that. But, what's your read on it?
Well, depending on which clickbaity website you click on to read about why Hamilton doesn't have a drive yet for 2021, there's various reasons. There's some that he doesn't want his lifestyle restricted. There's others where he wants to be more involved in fashion and music, and he wants the freedom to go off and do that. He wants more money, which I think probably makes the most logical sense. But it's a tough one because even though it's still a Mercedes factory team, Daimler only own 30% of the team now. Ineos own 30%. Toto Wolff owns... they all own a third each, basically taking over the shares that had been owned by Niki Lauda. So it's now split three ways, that team. And maybe one of the shareholders doesn't want to pay Lewis an exorbitant amount of money when chances are they could put the likes of George Russell or an other into that cockpit and still probably win the championship. So,
yeah, it's a good point, especially when you consider now. I mean, Toto Wolff can't exploit Lewis for marketing reasons because he's just a person. He's not a brand. I mean, he's a bit of a brand, but nonetheless. I mean, Ineos can only get so much out of Lewis Hamilton in particular, I guess. A Formula One driver is a Formula One driver probably from their marketing perspective. I'm sure they'd love Lewis, but it's really the 1/3 shareholder Mercedes that would probably in particular want him, right? Because he speaks to a section of the market that they really are keen on, that are traditionally not massive in, and he's been a big part of trying to bring the Mercedes demographic younger, so I can understand that. Obviously, the world champion, and he's very public. Like he's not just a world champion. I was walking yesterday, and he's still on the side of some trams in Melbourne because of his Tommy Hilfiger work. Like that, there aren't any other Formula One drivers on public transport in Melbourne, but he is. And look, Melbourne is not a great test case, but in general, I think that's probably a good, explanation. So that's actually, it's a good point I hadn't considered before. The fact that, I'm sure Toto Wolff obviously wants to keep him. His great mates there, but there's more, I suppose, of a hold up in the sense that, maybe 2/3 do want to pay him and the other third who's now stumping up the cash is not so keen on exorbitantly paying. But it's kind of interesting as well because obviously that deal was done relatively recently when you would have thought that his deal would be really written up. Only the fine print needed to be agreed and all that kind of stuff. So they should have done their deal to buy 1/3 of that company knowing the direction it was moving in. I don't know. It's really interesting. I wonder as well, maybe... this could be his last contract, right? We're certainly moving towards the end of his career at this point. If this isn't his last, he would maximum have another one. Depends on how many years he's going to do. Maybe the hold-up is really hammering out what his post-Formula One driving career involves with Mercedes, because I can see that contract lasting longer than just his driving career, and maybe it really is just forming that, and that could take time. I could imagine that, but... yeah, the fact that it's not really just the Mercedes team anymore is probably a really big part of that. I think you're right.
We've got to remember in 2006, Ferrari were willing to cast Michael Schumacher aside. And I was arguing with Luke Murphy about this recently. Luke is another guest that I have on the stream sometimes. But we were arguing about this, and it's more of a case of Mercedes might feel that maybe Lewis is bigger than the team now and is kind of making it more about Team Lewis Hamilton rather than Team Mercedes. And now obviously this is all conjecture. This is just a hypothesis. This isn't me saying that this is the case before any Hamilton fans start trying to find my address or whatever. But I think that maybe there's a case that they feel that they can win the championship without Lewis. We've seen how good the car is. The W11 was dominant throughout 2020, and they looked quite early in the season to development for 2021, the last season of the regulations. I don't think Mercedes are going to be caught in this regulation cycle. So I think 2021 is more of the same. They're going to win the championship again this year, but maybe they don't need Lewis to do that for them. So Russell filling in for Hamilton at Sakir was probably the worst possible timing for Lewis Hamilton and his contract negotiations, because it allowed Merck to see what they could do without Lewis kind of being at the wheel of the car. And again, they were on for a 1-2. Now, I know that the race fell apart for them as it went along, but that was more Mercedes than it was the drivers. So I'm curious to know whether one of the shareholders, and you've got to bear in mind that one of those shareholders is a new shareholder for this contract negotiation, because in previous contract negotiations it was Daimler, Wolff and Lauda, while now it's Daimler, Wolff and Ineos. So maybe it's possible that Ineos, coming in as a 1/3 partner, are going, "Feck no, I'm not paying that kind of money for Lewis. When we know that we can put George Russell in the car, or whoever they feel like putting in the car, and probably still win the championship anyway. The car is that dominant. Like, Valtteri Bottas is not the second best driver in the world, but he's finishing second in the standings. So if you put someone who's competently good into the car, they'll probably win the championship anyway. The car is that good.
And there's a strong argument to say if you wanted to put George Russell in the car, you would do it the year before the regs change, that you build up a bit of that knowledge for when you might really need to lean on the driver if the field does close up a bit the following year. Look, all those arguments make sense. Like, all those ideas, you could imagine a new shareholder coming in and saying these all make sense. And we know George Russell's a great driver. We know Valtteri Bottas is a quick driver, even if he's not, as you said, the second best driver in the world. And I mean, he nearly finished third in the championship standings this year. But nonetheless, look, I think I tempted sometimes to say he's a little bit underrated. Not a great racer, but very quick driver. But anyway, I wonder then what that means, though. But Toto Wolff is still in charge after all of this team. He's the CEO, and him and Mercedes still have 2/3. And look, Mercedes still want to be in Formula One, but obviously they've divested a little bit, so they only want to be in Formula One so much, which is fine. But I do wonder what that means. Let's say that really does break it down. Let's imagine that as a result, Hamilton isn't re-signed, which is still surely such a remote possibility. But just let's imagine, or even if this is the argument that's going on in the background, surely that potentially has quite negative effects on the team's outlook overall. Because one of the great strengths of this team has just been that predictability internally, that consistency internally, that Toto Wolff's kind of had a really firm hand on the tiller here. Mercedes, I've never even really had a sense as a company has intervened too much in the running of the team. Like, it's just been very much its own entity that's been allowed to grow into this super team, really. If you have a shareholder coming in now saying, well, we don't need Lewis Hamilton, even if it is because he wants a lot of money, let's say, and that's a fair argument on the surface, imagine what's going to happen to that team internally if all of a sudden they rock up in, preseason testing or whatever, and Lewis is gone. Like, he's been gone, never had his last race, never was farewell, just absolutely he's out. That seems so un-Mercedes to me as the team that I would be concerned that the subsequent effects on that team, and then not just from Lewis leaving, but what will that do to the people there who thought they understood how the team worked? Now maybe they'll be more willing to entertain other offers, things like that. For me, that would potentially be this concerning marker that this team might now be, I don't want to say in decline in a really negative way, like they're going to fall down the order, but suddenly won't be that kind of uncatchable team that they built themselves into, that super consistent team. I would be really concerned if I were one of the other shareholders, if that's the way it was going, because that's just not the way Mercedes does stuff. But I don't know. I mean, Toto Wolff is still in charge, right? So how bad could it be?
I don't know. But the thing is, when you look at the makeup of Mercedes now compared to this time last year, the shareholding as a factory entity for Daimler, it's not insignificant, the change. Daimler had 60%. They now own just over half of that. They now only own a third shareholding. So there was nothing stopping Ineos or Wolff from kind of going, let's rename the team, and it wouldn't be Mercedes anymore. So in terms of it being the same factory team representing the best interests of Mercedes, it's no longer quite like that. It's more it's not quite a privateer entry yet, but it's closer to being a privateer entry than it was this time last year. So the makeup of the team is changed compared to last year. So this is why I wonder whether there is this mindset change going on at the team where they could be kind of going, let's take a risk, let's put someone medium to long term in the car rather than someone who's coming to the end of their tenure in Formula One. Now I think Hamilton still has at least 5 good years left in him. He's only 36 1985, January 85 I think is his birthday, so he's just turned 36, which is mind-boggling. I still view him as the young guy, but I think he still has at least 5 years at the front of Formula One in him if he really wanted to. But in terms of looking to the medium and long term, this was the part. This was the stage of the career for Ferrari when they suddenly turned their back on Michael. Michael was 37 when Ferrari just went, and Luca de Montezemolo went, okay, let's look to the future. Michael, you're out. There was no sentiment involved. There was no kind of, let's do it out of respect for Michael. It was, announce your retirement now. And Michael was backed into that corner and he was forced out. Now, he did get those few races at the end of his career, which is possibly more than what Lewis hypothetically has now. But I don't think there's anything ridiculous or impossible about we might have seen Lewis in his last race with Mercedes. I don't think it's likely, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, the only difference with the Schumacher example, I suppose, that Ferrari was ready to kind of rebuild, if you like to redouble its efforts to prepare for the next generation. They'd lost the championship. That run of, it'll be more like if they dropped Schumacher in 2003 or something like that, when he was winning top of the world. No real reason that was about to stop, I suppose.
But 2006, he did nearly win the championship.
It's true, but I guess you would say that, well, they've lost it twice. There was a need to change things to try and overcome Renault, right? And then, of course, there was the spectre.
Just to interrupt for a sec, the announcement of his retirement was at Monza 2006, which was actually one of the high points of it, because that was the one where Alonso's engine went boom, and Michael ran away with. Michael ran away with the win. So at that exact moment, it actually looked like everything was coming up roses for Ferrari and Michael.
That's true.
And then
that is a good point.
And then at that exact moment, he went, "Oh yeah, I'm actually out. Kimi's coming in."
Yeah, look, it's true. And I mean, look, the parallel is there to be made, I suppose, isn't it? And again, like we were already saying, this would be the moment to bring in your next long-term driver. Maybe that is the argument. Maybe, because I'd always imagined that even if Lewis did, let's say, a 3-year deal, the standard kind of deal, that if he won the championship next year, beat Schumacher's record, he'd wrap it up. That's he's done everything at that point. He's got everything. Clearly, he has other interests in Formula One. I could imagine him packing it up and leaving 2 years early or whatever. Maybe it's a matter of him really only wanting a 1-year deal and everyone wants him on longer. Maybe that's part of the reason, is that they clearly are very far apart in terms of the length of their desire to stay as a team. That could also be a factor. Because then if you want to bring that back to the Schumacher idea, they wanted the next long-term guy. Schumacher was 37, right? And, probably still had more years in him. But Raikkonen was the young guy, shown a lot of promise at McLaren, that kind of stuff. He was going to be their next champion. No, he was the next champion. You could look at Hamilton and say, well, he's going to be, if he signs, he's going to be the champion next year. But, even if he's got 5 years in him, which I would agree with you, I don't think he will take those 5 years. It's hard to predict with Lewis, but I can't imagine him still racing in 5 years, because he'll have done everything, unless the racing is really good, if he's around in 2022, that he's so invigorated by it that he wants to continue, because I think he does love that competition aspect. But otherwise, I can't imagine him going that far. And so maybe there is a thought that it's like, well, why are we keeping on this guy for 1 year at some exorbitant price when we know George is good? We know he probably needs another year in top machinery to really bed into this team. Let's just chuck him in next year. I could imagine that. These are all really good arguments. But then do they outweigh the argument of, it's like, well, you got the best driver in Formula One at your team already. Why aren't you re-signing him? It's interesting. It will be interesting to see the outcome. Whatever, I'm sure it'll be a re-signing, but then the time on that, the money, which we'll guess over time, I guess.
It turns out that we got an email while we've been talking, and he's been signed for a 3-year deal.
Is that true?
No.
Oh, you're panicking me.
No, I Mercedes aren't going to announce Lewis Hamilton at it's midnight. They're not going to announce him at midnight GMT.
To be fair, Davide Brivio was announced on a Sunday for some reason.
Sunday morning at 9 a.m.
Yeah, that was strange. Yeah. Why a Sunday?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's
the day Renault. Of rest.
Yeah, thanks for that, Renault. Woke up at 12 o'clock and just went, oh, God, I have to write this story up now. I think we could hypothesize about Lewis all day until something happens, but something is causing a hold up, and more than likely it's just plain and simply down to money, because there isn't really a whole lot else that they could be arguing over. Out of the options that are available, you have to say money is the most obvious one. Maybe the length of the contract is possibly another stumbling block. But whatever is the reason, Lewis is still a free agent. Mercedes still have a free cockpit. And there's every possibility that Lewis won't be in the Merc.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think, isn't it? I mean, he was one of the only drivers to come out against a driver salary cap, right? So another reason to think that it's about money. I know the salary cap isn't finalised or in place yet, but, you know, this could be his last paycheck, like we were saying. This could be his last contract. I'm sure he's trying to get the maximum out of it. But, yeah, I mean, the other reason to be surprised if he didn't sign, aside from all the other reasons, is just that Toto Wolff is there. Like they've been so much a part of each other's career in the later years. With Toto Wolff in place, that would almost be the most surprising part of him not signing, is that somehow a Toto Wolff run team couldn't figure out a way to keep Lewis. That would be the biggest shock to me.
Yeah, I think it's a case of watch this space, and hopefully we'll get an announcement soon. Before
check your inboxes every Sunday morning.
Yeah, pre-season testing is going to be it's not formal yet, but it's going to be in Bahrain for 3 days. No testing in Spain this year, in Barcelona. So that is probably going to be the reason that it hasn't been formalized yet is because they're aiming for early March. Kind of around the 10th, 11th, 12th, those kind of days. But the teams are pushing back because it's too close to shipping out to Bahrain, and they don't want it that close to the first race, which I think is a bit strange because it's usually quite close to flying out to Australia. So
yeah, and you'd think you'd just make it an easy one stop kind of mission to go in, test race, but
maybe it's the fact that they'd have to fly over and back, or just wait around in Bahrain for 2 weeks. Because
I suppose so.
It'd be fly to Bahrain, do your 3 days of testing, fly home with everything, or leave it sitting there for 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I imagine too that the restrictions it's still a little while away, but in terms of the virus, will probably be more strict this year than they were last year, considering things have really amped up quite a bit in the meanwhile. So if you're sitting around for 2 weeks, you might be sitting around in essentially hotel quarantine or similar situations. So I can imagine them wanting to avoid that.
Yeah, so presumably if the teams get their way, pre-season testing will be held in maybe late February, as it usually is. And by then, we have to know who's in the Merc. Whoever the hell it's going to be. I still think it will be Lewis. I can't really see anything else changing. I can't see Mercedes taking the risk and going, let's put Russell in the car and cause all this kerfuffle and throw away Lewis. It's possible that they will change it, but I don't think they will. I think it will still be Lewis in the car.
Well, because then the other thing is you're kind of tacitly banking on Bottas to be a medium-term driver, which, look, he could be good enough to be that, but that didn't seem like the way Mercedes was moving, was it? He's been constantly on a 1-year deal, and then to turn around and go, you're the long-term partner with George Russell, or medium-term or whatever, that's also a bit of a surprise, isn't it?
Yeah, no, the 1-year deal after this length of time with the team really shows that they don't have a huge amount of confidence in him, and they're giving themselves the option to drop him the minute that they want to, or they have a better option available to them. So, yeah, look, we'll do this again soon. Because I've just noticed we've been talking for nearly an hour and a half. So, Michael Lamonato from... Yeah, go on. Where are you from? The Strategy Report podcast and the Box of Neutrals. Thank you very much for joining me on the stream, Michael.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Because of the weird time zones, I'm off to bed. So... I will talk to you later, and to everybody that's been watching in as well, thank you very much, and thanks for all your questions and comments. We'll do this again probably midweek next week. Don't know who the guests are yet, but sure, we'll figure that out closer to the time. Thanks. See you.